And so because of that, because of the wall they built around them, it made the investigation stall, and it created a situation in which we're still dealing with it 20 years later.
Tom, I want to go back to you because this is one of, I think, 4.
Now, what you've just seen there, and you really need to ignore the audio and just look at focus on what you are seeing. That was part of the promotional campaign, the promotional effort behind the case of JonBenet Ramsey. And they went to quite a lot of trouble to recreate the scene, including JonBenet's bedroom. And so I want you to look at this recreation again and try and see if you notice things in this recreated bedroom that are not accurate, that are not JonBenet's bedroom. There's certain basics that are true, the 2 beds, the little cabinet in the middle, but what is not the same?
Right, a beautiful young girl in a small town, wealthy family. I understand why people are still fascinated. Our project is different. It is not a look back at what happened so much as it is, a real-time investigation into new facts and new evidence.
As far as I know, neither of those scenes actually made it into the docuseries. I don't remember seeing both of those investigators standing in the recreated room of JonBenet Ramsey, which is kind of a shame. Also walking up to the ransom note as it's been restaged. In a weird way, what I want to do in this episode is take you back to JonBenet's room, go back inside JonBenet's room, not a recreation of it, but actually take you inside that room. And we're going to do it in 2 ways. One through the crime scene footage and the crime scene photos, and the other is by walking alongside another investigator, another peripheral figure that you probably never heard of before, and getting a look at this bedroom through her eyes, through the eyes of Holly Smith.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Now, this is definitely going to, I think, raise a couple of eyebrows. This is extremely obscure information. It was published in 2006, so 19 years ago, on the 13th of November. And if someone like Dr. Booth is peripheral, he's still somewhat central to the periphery. Holly Smith is extremely external to this whole story, and you can be forgiven if you've never heard her name. Is there anyone out there listening that has heard of Holly Smith? Well, we're going to deal with who she is at the end of this analysis. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the many of you who have subscribed. Bear in mind, today is Monday, February 17th, which means the Gabby Petito docuseries is dropped on Netflix. We are going to be covering that on this channel, so look out for that. If you find this analysis worthwhile, interesting, helpful, it's taken you into an area you've never thought of before, somewhere meaningful, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. So we're going to an article from Fox 31 News, as I say, dated 30 November 2006. And of course, this article predated the CBS docuseries by 10 years, exactly 10 years. And this article came out approaching the 10-year anniversary of the JonBenet Ramsey case. And that's how the article opens. The 10th anniversary of the murder of JonBenet Ramsey is rapidly approaching. Remember, it was written in November. The whirlwind surrounding the arrest and release of John Mark Carr shows it's a mystery that continues to capture the nation's attention. So that was what was kind of spinning around the media narrative of John Mark Carr. He was the pedophile of the moment, and of course he came and went. There was no arrest at the end of the day, no charges. Fox 31 News and investigative reporter Julie Hayden have received new information as one of the investigators talks for the first time about her experiences with the case. Who's the investigator here? Holly Smith. Have you ever heard of Holly Smith as one of the investigators in Boulder that went into this case, that looked into this case. And she, as investigators go, had a very unique perspective. And here it is. Holly Smith recently wrote a book about her 20 years with the Boulder County SA team. In her book, she left out the chapter about the Ramsey case. In other words, didn't include that. Although she investigated the Ramsey case, didn't include that in her book, but is now revealing her part of the investigation exclusively to us on this 10-year anniversary. And so the article continues, Holly Smith remembers walking up the steps to the Ramsey home, the big candy canes more jarring than festive, considering the circumstances. The house was lavishly decorated. Okay, so not just decorated, lavishly decorated. And so Smith actually said it was big and it was meandering and it was schmancy fancy, meaning the house. The house was big. The house was meandering. There were all sorts of corridors. And wherever you went, it was schmancy fancy. There was a lot of excess, a lot of Christmas trees. And obviously she was there very early on in terms of the crime scene. It was actually the third day of the investigation, so probably the 29th of December. So she was essentially present during the ground zero, and I think that is way different than a recreation of the crime scene. I think some of the smells are still there. Of course, the one-woman raid of the crime scene had just taken place from Patsy's sister. That was, I think, possibly the day before. And so, for all intents and purposes, Holly got to step into pretty much the original bedroom of JonBenet. And this was a young woman with a very unique perspective. She was the head of the Boulder County SA team, and she'd been called into the investigation. Why? Well, she says to consult about some of the dynamics and some of the things people suspected might be going on with this case. And if you look at those words, she's been quite coy. She's been quite vague about exactly what was being suspected and the dynamics of who and what. And I think when you look at the books that she wrote and you look at the papers that she's written, you kind of get an idea of why she was brought in and what was being considered at this early point, 3 days into the investigation. And so she started, like, how did she begin to deal with the question, is SA a factor? She's the head of that. She's the head of that team. And how does she begin to think about and investigate, was this child a victim of SA? Well, she started with a visit to the child's bedroom. And this is where it gets really interesting. She says, that's a really important piece of getting a real feel for a family, right? And so she's saying you can get a real feel for JonBenet through her bedroom. And isn't that true? Wasn't that true for you when, if someone came into your room, they would have gotten a sense of who you were. And don't you get a sense of that in other people's bedrooms and in other people's homes? And this is where it gets really interesting. As she says, with portfolio pictures galore and closets full of JonBenet's elaborate pageant outfits, Smith says she had a hard time getting a feel for who the little girl really was, even in her bedroom. And I find this an astonishing insight for its incisiveness. She was basically saying she was standing in JonBenet's bedroom and she was struggling to get a read on this little girl. She was struggling to get a sense of who is this little girl. And it wasn't because the bedroom was bare. It wasn't because it was Spartan. It wasn't because it was sparsely decorated. If anything, it was the opposite. It was cluttered. It was untidy. And yet, despite the surfeit of signs and symbols and toys and accoutrements in this room, she couldn't get a sense of JonBenet. And so she says, and this is again just an incredible insight, she said, I just had a sense the type of decor in her bedroom was not really a child's decor. And what do you think she means by that? She's saying that it felt like JonBenet's inhabiting a room that is really somebody else's. It's really someone else's style. It's really someone else's imprint on that room. It's really someone else's fashioning of the room. And bear in mind, obviously Patsy had put the Christmas tree there, but think about it as well. There's a big framed picture of JonBenet. Now, would a child normally put a framed picture of themselves in their own bedroom in a prominent sense. Now, just to more completely sketch out the full extent, the full scale and scope of JonBenet's room, let's go to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Lawrence Schiller writes, JonBenet's second-floor bedroom with a porch overlooking the south yard and patio was closest to the spiral staircase. The room had a hand-painted hat motif, and the nursery rhyme Hey Diddle Diddle was painted on a carved corner cabinet. Now, just think about those words already. A hat motif. There's a motif in the room. And remember that Patsy would bring hundreds of guests through the house and sort of put the house on display, almost as though the house is a pageant in its own right, and sort of just sort of brag about the certain elements, the stylish elements in each room. Paintings, there's even we'll get to the painting in the bathroom, JonBenet's bathroom, in a moment. Schiller also mentions the police removed a small piece of carpet in front of the night table between the matching English burl walnut single beds. He notes, to the left of the bed, the detectives had removed 2 additional pieces of carpet. At the foot of JonBenet's bed, there was a hand-painted locker that matched the fabrics in the room. Do you notice it's hand-painted? I wonder whether Patsy painted it or she got some kind of specialist artist in. All of JonBenet's sheets, pillowcases, and bed covers were taken into custody by the police. Now, the question is, when did that happen? Was it already taken into custody by the time Holly Smith got there? Well, we just don't know. Fingerprint powder was everywhere except on the painted hooks of I've got no idea how to pronounce that, Trompe l'oeil hat rack stenciled on the closet doors. JonBenet's closet was stuffed with clothes. A small TV set with a built-in VCR sat on a shelf inside her closet. Other shelves had dozens of cartoon and Shirley Temple videos. So just in JonBenet's room, there's a sense of a TV addict. And so weren't there TV addicts in other rooms? And so weren't the Ramseys excessive consumers of movies? And think about the content of the ransom note. To the right of the closet stood a pageant trophy as tall as the light switch. So there's a light switch there, just doesn't activate the lamp next to her bed on the bedside table. And as far as I know, the actual light in the room didn't work. The only light that did work was from the bedside table. Another trophy was even taller. There was a floor-to-ceiling Christmas tree in the room too. And here it is. In her bathroom hung an original pastel called Tea for Two by a Boulder artist. And you can imagine stepping into the bathroom going, well, this is obviously not the choice of a little girl. And is it the appropriate choice, this particular painting in the bathroom? And an interesting question is, when this essay team leader was in the bathroom, did she notice those pajama pants on the ground? Did she question them? Were they still there? Did she identify them? And so what she says to Fox 31 is, one poignant find that she does recall was a red satin box with what looked like JonBenet's secret stash of candy. So what stands out in her memory was a red box with candy in it. Now we know that there was candy that was smeared. Was it that particular box? And she doesn't mention that, but maybe that is what stood out in her memory. But she certainly doesn't disclose that in this interview. But then she found something else in the room that raised to her a red flag, an immediate red flag. Smith says most of the panties in JonBenet's dresser drawer had been soiled with fecal material. And she brings a child psychology perspective to this case. Just think about the language she uses when she says, there is this dynamic of children that have been essayed, sometimes soiling themselves or urinating in their beds to keep someone who is hurting them at bay. Now, my personal opinion is I'm not sure that was happening in this case. It seems to be, to me, just ordinary meat and potatoes neglect. In the same sense of a child being allowed to wet her bed, in the same sense her dirty underwear being allowed to accumulate. But she's the expert in this area. And so the article continues to note, JonBenet also had a history of bedwetting. Smith points out there could be innocent explanations, and she's right, there could be. But she also says this was the kind of information that raised questions. And so she was simply saying, well, I'm a little bit concerned by this history of bedwetting. And that concern would be great if it's chronic and if it's recent and given the age of the child and in combination to this soiling of the underwear. And it is a complex question, which is why we need to deal with these subtleties cautiously. And Holly Smith seems to diagnose or seems to understand that the bedwetting was chronic because she mentions it. She says it's very different for every child, meaning bedwetting. But when you have a child that's had this problem and it's pretty chronic for that child, and in addition you know some sort of physical evidence or trauma or an allegation, you put all those little pieces together and it just goes in your head, she says. And don't you get a sense that she's choosing her words very carefully? Do you see how she includes some sort of physical evidence? Now, we're at almost 16 minutes in this video. I don't want to overload you with information. We need to find out a bit more about Holly Smith, what her background is, and the book that she wrote, and then also get a little bit more of a sense of what she was angling at in this interview. It goes on quite a bit further. So I'm not going to take it further than that, but I do also want to return to that grapefruit-sized piece of dung found in the sheets, and I want to talk about that and some of the implications about that. And so we'll also be dealing with that, revisiting that in a forthcoming analysis. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.